So I think we'll take individual questions and then maybe spill over slightly over 11:30. I know the blue bags are waiting for us, but I'm sure that all of you have very interesting questions in light of these presentations.
Yeah. To the panel, really. I know that the heads of churches in the Middle East had met previously with President Obama and with President Holland. And yet their impressions coming out of these two meetings was that really nothing was promised. And my question to the panel, how can we support, how can governments in the West and elsewhere, including the Arab world, can support various minorities without really singling out these minorities out of their national context? In other words, not feeling that they are being given preferential treatment, and therefore really raise more sensitivities, okay? And one question to Rami is that the argument that the Arab-Israeli conflict is one source of destabilizing factor in the Middle East. The Israeli counter-argument for that is that the problems of the Middle East have nothing to do with Israel, and it's really a fictional kind of argument by some Arab propagandists. Really, the question is, what the Israelis are saying, if there is a reconciliation with the Israeli position on that, then would the Middle East be happily ever after wedded to Israel and to Iran and to Turkey and to the other countries? Thank you.
Should we answer? I'll answer that second question. First of all, it's extraordinary how much attention major Western leaders give to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Obama did a lot. Bush tried it, Clinton, everybody tries to focus and try to solve this problem. The Europeans, the French now are thinking of an initiative. They keep trying, but they don't succeed because they don't really know how to be effective and fair mediators. And therefore they keep failing. But I think there's a recognition globally that resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, particularly the Palestinian-Israeli, Zionist-Arabist conflict, is a critical step towards reducing tensions and will have a positive impact on almost all other problems in the region. It will not now solve anything, but imagine if the Arab-Israeli conflict had been resolved in 1979, before Hamas and Hezbollah had come into being. Would we have had this Iranian-Israeli tension? Would we have had this great Iranian-Western tension? If the Arab-Israeli conflict was resolved equitably and fairly to the satisfaction of the Palestinians and the Israelis, and if the Arab peace plan, for instance, had been accepted and we had resolved this problem, we would have many, many fewer regional tensions and problems. The role of Western mediators who successfully do this would be significantly enhanced. The ability of the economies of the region to achieve economies of scale, to work together to achieve the well-being of all people in the region through production and trade, etc., and tourism, water sharing. I mean, virtually every aspect of life would be improved politically, materially, economically, if the Arab-Israeli conflict were resolved. It would not in itself be an instant solution to all the other problems, because these other problems have grown over the years and will take years to resolve. But the Arab-Israeli conflict remains the critical living link between 19th century imperialism and colonialism and the denial of Arab citizenship and nationalism. It remains, the colonial expansion of Israel in the occupied territory remains the living link from the 19th century European colonialists to our lives today. And this is one reason why this issue resonates so widely. And I'd just make one other comment. And why is it that the keffiyeh, the Palestinian checkered headdress, has become the universal system, the universal symbol of progressive politics and personal resistance. It's very interesting to see. So there's a resonance to justice for Palestinians and equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians to live peacefully in two adjacent states. There's a resonance there that is so powerful, and that's one reason why people keep trying in the White House and everywhere to figure out what can we do about this problem. They just don't do it efficiently or fairly or equitably, and therefore it remains unsolved.
Just a couple of comments. One, I think providing assistance to Christians in the region, I guess how can the U.S. do that more effectively without unintentionally making them targets? I think discourse is important. This is something that Brian and I have talked about, the politics of discourse. The importance of emphasizing that the at-risk strategy, the at-risk condition of Christians and a response to that can be more effectively articulated as support for pluralism and preservation of pluralism in the region, and by extension for structures of governance that are premised on individual rights and equality before the law. So in some ways you redefine the discourse in order to take it away from a focus on Christians per se, but why it is that Christians offer us a window into the importance of supporting pluralism and rule of law structures and governance that support pluralism. The second is, I think that it's important to recognize, and this again is in some ways a political discursive question as well, but that focusing on Christians and their very, very urgent status in many countries in the region is important because it gives us a window into, and it's a commitment to recognizing the at-risk status of other very vulnerable communities, Yazidis, Shabaks, Mandians, Baha'is, etc. And looking the other way in terms of what's been happening to Christians for the last 90 years since the establishment of states in the region has given a green light to authoritarian regimes, whether under the guise of secularism or now under the guise of religious regimes, to basically eradicate those populations and knowing that there is nothing that will be paid. There will be no consequences for that. So if it's open season on Christians and it's open season on Yazidis or Baha'is or Mandians, etc. So signaling that the current condition of Christians is about a larger problematic in the region. And then finally, how do you actually do that? How do you implement it on the ground without, again, making them sort of targets? I think this can occur through a prudent and judicious use of humanitarian tools. And yesterday, the really interesting presentation on human rights law and humanitarianism, I think drives home the fact that the humanitarian model, although it's rightly been premised on not privileging any particular group, it's been premised on need. The fact of the matter is that it's come to be very inflexible, so that the way in which we define need has been disconnected from larger considerations of facing elimination and or extinction. And so I think a more flexible application of humanitarian aid is a way that we can deliver assistance on the ground. And that can be done, again, in a way that is confession blind, religion blind, but that ultimately recognizes that there are communities that are momentarily short-term more at risk than the others. And then finally, in terms of political settlements, and this again is where I think language is very instructive. Most of the discussions about, for example, a normalization of the Syrian situation or a post-ISIS Iraq have been overwhelmingly articulated in terms of Sunni-Shia reconciliation or Sunni-Shia Kurdish reconciliation in Iraq, reducing Iraq then to those either religious or ethnic communities, and by extension, eliminating any of the other communities from the conversation, or they're just add-ons or footnotes. And we saw what happened in the first round of structural rebuilding in Iraq and the consequences for Christians, Yazidis, and others in Iraq. And secondly, the same holds true in the case of Syria. Discussions about normalization of Syria have tended to focus on what do you do with the Syrian opposition, the multitude of Sunni representations, or the Alawites. There is another community in the country. There are other communities in the country. And the language of that and the politics of that implies the perpetuation of a series of trend lines that mean that Christians will soon be gone from the region. And I think it's important to actually speak openly about that in order to be accurate in terms of the composition of the country and the possibilities for pluralism on the ground.
If I could just add on Elizabeth's first point, and we agree with this, that a framework of pluralism, inclusivity, I would add justice, are important. I would add, though, and hopefully it's not too cynical of a comment, is that it's almost an academic idea. From my experience analyzing US policy over the years in terms of its implementation. One criticism I've had, and I'm quite partial to President Obama relative to his predecessor and I suspect his successor, though it's still too soon to tell. He was reluctant to talk about these issues very much in terms of pluralism, inclusivity. He did it a bit more in his first year. A new beginning, we're not at war with Islam, and other things. But the one criticism I had with that framework that was used was this Muslim world engagement framework, which I think essentialized a certain identity and downplayed sort of the concerns or the potential for advancing pluralism, freedom, and inclusivity. So I would stress, I think it's an academic point based on past experience, and I suspect based on who our president-elect is and the illiberal and exclusionary rhetoric he used here at home, I think it's probably not likely he'll use that framework. The second thing I'd say, and I had friends who were in that meeting at the White House, so this is secondhand, the meeting of Christian leaders who came for the In Defense of Christian conference. The one comment I think they had was the divisions amongst some of the participants who were in that meeting as well. I know that, as I said in my presentation, the views of different Christian communities in different countries are diverse. But trying to present at least a common front when you're sitting next door to the Oval Office might, I mean, and again, I want to hedge it because I'm not certain under President Obama, or I think his predecessor was much more attuned to this, but the tragedy was that President Bush presided over the decimation of some of the oldest Christian communities, in part, I mean, as a consequence of the Iraq War and other things. So I don't want to sound too cynical. I'm at this moment still digesting and as an analyst trying to understand where we're headed in our engagement, but I think your first point, she and I have talked about it, that's the right framework. I'm not certain the door was ever open, and it seems to be shutting when it comes to US engagement on the basis of liberalism, inclusion, and pluralism.
Thank you, Brian. Next question.
Yes. My name is Bashar Qubain, and I'm an Arab American with Jordanian Christian descent. And I'm interested in, I mean, this is a general question for the panel. I'm interested in your opinion about the widespread of conspiracy theories in the Middle East and the lack of accountability and, personal responsibility, so to speak, for the current state of affairs as possible contributing factors to the region's problems? And if so, I mean, what can be done about that? Thank you.
In the interest of time, could we limit the answers to that question?
You want to take several questions?
Sure, yeah, why don't we group them? Yeah, we'll take maybe two more, three more. Okay, perfect. We have over here, and then here.
This is a question for Dr. Prodromou. Thank you for a very dynamic exposition of the geopolitical struggles and cultural geopolitical struggles in the area. My question is if you have any thoughts specifically about Greece. Greece is sort of embroiled in this situation because of the large number of refugees that are stuck in Greece. Also, politically, the Greek government and the Greek people have definitely, clearly, despite the crisis, the economic crisis, stayed faithful to the European Union and their association with the West. How about the Greek Orthodox Church? Russia already has played this card that you have mentioned in splitting Ukraine between the Orthodox Ukrainians and the Catholic Ukrainians. Do you see the Greek Orthodox Church and then the rest of the patriarchs having more of a hope of reconciliation and closer collaboration with Catholicism, or do you think they're going to fall in the Russian camp in this conflict?
Thank you. Steve?
Rami, you made a
Take the
compelling...
mic.
Yeah.
Take the mic.
Thank you. Rami, I thought you made a compelling case that the Westphalian nation-state system has failed in the Middle East as a successor regime to empire, which leaves everybody sort of depressed because what other alternative do we have these days? Which raises another thought that there is another alternative in evolutionary situations, which I think we've forgotten about, which is the UN Trusteeship Council, which is the notion of a trusteeship administration, an interim administration of trusteeship, which is not a nation-state sovereign, but which is capable of dealing with all people on the basis of their identities. So the question is, would it make sense to sort of try, particularly in the case of Syria today, to take nation-state sovereignty off the table and talk about a failed state, a non-governing territory, which deserves some kind of apparatus which can deliver education, health, security, et cetera, to people?
Is there a final question over here? Okay.
I thank you. Two interrelated questions. Turkey, for upwards of 75 years, had a highly secularized society, as did Iran under the Shah, but to a lesser extent. That says to me that secularism is not entirely foreign to Middle Eastern societies, and I wondered if any of you see any evidence of that recurring. My related question is, over the last 50 years, in both America and most of Europe, there's been a great rapprochement between Catholics and Protestants. Do you see any evidence of that occurring between Sunnis and Shiites in the Middle East?
Thank you thank you everyone for the questions. Panelists?
The state system is under pressure. It's remarkable how stable the states and their frontiers have been since they were created in the last 100 years. It's quite remarkable. The problem isn't so much the state superstructure. The problem is the infrastructure, the software of how the states are run internally, the relationship between the citizen and the government and the state and the power structure. And as I said, the most important thing is legitimacy. These states not only have never been defined by their citizens for the most part, they've never been ratified or verified or confirmed or validated by their citizens after they were established. So they're very fragile, they're very frail, they have different levels of durability and legitimacy and efficacy. And now the big test, of course, is the ones that have had a lot of money and have camouflaged their state weaknesses with lots of money from oil to run welfare states. They now are under pressure. They're cutting budgets. They're asking their citizens to tighten their belts to pay more for water, electricity. We're going to see the relationship tested for the first time ever between citizen and state in wealthy Arab oil and energy producing countries. So I don't think the state system itself is a problem. I think it can work, and these people, these different people in different Arab countries have all managed many aspects of their states very well. You know, higher education for women in the Arab countries was expanding faster than education for women in East Asia for many decades. So we've done some pretty remarkable things in terms of national development and state building. We've just never done it according to the will of the citizen or the consent of the governed, and that's the missing element. This trusteeship issue I don't think is very practical, except if it's decided by the people themselves. If some citizens, if the Somalis get together and say, look, we'd like the Swedes to help us transition again to sovereignty, then fine. But it's got to be done with the will of the people. And then I just comment on the question on secularism. Again, this is a question for the citizens of each country to decide on. What we know is that imposed secularism generates a strong resurgence of religiosity. We've seen this all over the Middle East. Turkey is one of the best examples, and Iran as well. So I think the other factor that's true, we know from real serious and continuous polling evidence in the Arab world, that Arabs are religious, but they don't want to be run by religious authorities. They don't want to be ruled like Iran is ruled or Saudi Arabia so more or less is ruled by religious authority, but they want religious values to permeate their society, and those values are mercy and equality and justice and, you know, the things we all share. So finding that balance between religiosity and secularism is one of the great challenges that we have. And I have no doubt that we can find that balance. I mean, the constitutional debates in Tunisia and Egypt between 2011 and 2013 were spellbinding for the depth, the breadth, and the intensity of the discussions of issues of Arabism, of Islam, of religiosity, of the role of rights of women, the minorities, the state-citizen relations. These issues were discussed with tremendous vigor and honesty and clarity in public for the first time ever. And that's one of the reasons why the Tunisians made the breakthrough. The Egyptians didn't, because the curse of the modern Arab world, which is military rule, came back to bite us again. So I think this issue of secularism is clearly in the future of the Arab world, but only once the state is stable and citizens are treated with dignity, and therefore it evolves naturally.
Thank you.
Oh, conspiracy theories, yes. This is fascinating. There is a real serious conspiracy theories legacy in the modern Arab world, and it doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's not part of our religion, it's not part of our water. It comes out of the reality that average citizens, for the last 100 years, more or less, have never really participated in making big decisions that shape their futures. They've seen decisions made for them by external powers, whether it's openly done or it's surreptitious regime changes or whatever. They've seen decisions in their lives affected by invading foreign armies, and these invading foreign armies now are coming from Russia, coming from Iran, and and from Saudi Arabia. They're not just coming from England and France as they used to in the past. And they don't have a free press to be able to really talk about their ideas. So the ultimate reaction of ordinary Arab citizens is that, well, our lives are determined by somebody else, and somebody's got a plan to do this for us. And that's why you always hear people in the Arab world talk about al-mashru' al-Ameriki, you know, the American project or the American plan, and where there is no, I mean, you know, Washington can't make plans about the Middle East any more than I can make plans about landing a solar vehicle on Venus, because it's totally beyond Washington's capability to do anything seriously, programmatically credible and systematic in the Middle East. But people in the Arab world think that there are plans afoot all the time by foreign powers. So this conspiracy theory comes out of the experience of their own lives. It's not something that is just weird Arab weirdness.
If I could just say two things. One on the conspiracy theories, and if you see in the news just here in our own country, we're not immune to it. And it's actually a dangerous phenomenon in my hometown, where a man went in armed into a pizza place that I go to with my family because there was a conspiracy theory promoted in an alternative media outlet, but then also by a number of people who are associated with the incoming administration, promoted actively. So in an era of media fragmentation and in an era where traditional political forces we've seen in the Middle East face challenges from, you know, skepticism and doubt and things like this, but the reliance on basic facts and reality, I think is something that all societies, including open societies, face. On the Shia-Sunni tensions, are there any signs? Again, as I tried to say in my remarks, it's one element of what's happening in the region. My experience when I've been for extended periods of time in Lebanon or Iraq or other places, at a popular level, and you can disabuse me of this, it really isn't as strong as it is politically. And I think these identities, especially in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran, are exploited and used for their own authoritarian purposes. I think our engagement, and again, we haven't talked about US engagement in all of this, I think we're largely on the margins of this. I think some in the Obama administration hoped that the Iran nuclear deal would produce some sort of equilibrium, which I thought was far-fetched and abstract from the game that regional powers, not the people, but the powers were playing. And the last thing I'd say in that, on the second remark, is that the only way, I think, to reduce those tensions goes back to the first point of what we do about it, when I said it has to come from the region. A lot of the talk and discussion about equal citizenship, the intellectual foundations for that, the ideological foundations for that, the political leadership that is needed from the region, it actually has to come organically in a way to basically counter that sectarianism. I fear, again, that the US, we've been largely a bystander. I fear that what we're likely to see in the approach of the US engagement, if it's engaged as much, may add fuel to the fire of some of those sectarian fires. It's still uncertain, it's still unclear, but I feel like whenever you hear language that it's exclusionary and illiberal, in essence, it can feed a dynamic that's already, I think, quite negative, but doesn't reflect where general populations, I think, in individual countries are.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure. Quickly about the first question on Greece. I think Greece is an interesting case for a lot of reasons with regard to what we're talking about. Let me just say a few things. Number one, last year alone, 800,000 migrants passed through Greece, which would be the equivalent of about 12 million migrants passing through the United States last year. So the numbers, I think, are instructive. I think the reaction to the causes and the reaction to the forced migration flows through Greece tell a story again about geopolitics. On the one hand, the effort of EU member states to quarantine for the most part and restrict the impact of migration flows and migrants to Mediterranean Europe and in particular to Greece has been very interesting, despite Mrs. Merkel's discussion and discourse about welcoming migrants. That's not been a European-wide phenomenon, and certainly in terms of what EU member states consider to be core Europe, the reaction in terms of religious pluralism and welcoming migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers has been quite shocking. I mean, we keep talking about walls here, but walls are going up all over EU member states. And it's a hostile reaction to not only migration flows, but I think to the realities of a religiously plural Europe. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think the European Union's response to Greece and the relative lack of support to a country that has been going through an economic depression, not a recession, but a depression for the last 6 years, has been informed by a kind of cultural geography. And we see it in the language that has been deployed across Europe about Greeks being lazy, Greeks being shifty, Greeks being dishonest, the kind of racist language that we heard, unfortunately, from our president-elect. And that's been used quite freely and reiterated through the mainstream media in Europe. So, and the reasons for that, if you begin to excavate it, have to do with the fact that contemporary Greeks are a poor expression of their classical, pure classical progenitors. And why are they poor expressions? Because they're part of the Byzantine-Ottoman interaction. I mean, it's all there in the social science literature. Read travel literature if you want, and you'll see it most fully expressed. So I think there's a lot going on in terms of cultural geography and cultural geopolitics and hard geopolitics. Regarding the second piece, the Orthodox Church and Orthodox Roman Catholic reconciliation, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm thankful for that, that train has left in the station and continues. The current patriarch, ecumenical patriarch, and pope are committed to, ongoing reconciliation. The Pan-Orthodox Council that occurred this summer in Crete, that was meant to be 14 Orthodox churches, 4 of them didn't come, including the Patriarchate of Moscow, was convened by the ecumenical patriarch. I was one of 4 women in the assembly on the official delegations, 4 too little, but at least there were 4. There was a commitment there by those who came, as opposed to the spoilers who didn't, to ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. It's not necessarily reflected in the text, but it was there, I can assure you, in the arguments and discussions in the room. And then finally, so that's, as far as I'm concerned, a very good thing. And then finally on Turkey. Turkey, yes, was a secular regime for, I guess, from 1923 through, if we want to say 2003 in the election of AKP. The sad thing about secularity in Turkey is that it in no way was a democracy or a rule of law society when it came to the rights of its Christian communities, and more generally in terms of religious expression. And Turkey's presided over the single most complete and systematic effort at religious cleansing of any of the countries in the Middle East. Look at the numbers, look at the violent and nonviolent policies, and you see the outcome on the ground, but they've gotten a free pass because they're NATO member states. So,
thank you, Elizabeth. Please thank me in congratulating our panelists. Thank you.